So we've talked already about the United States' role in imperialism of the Caribbean and of different parts of the world in the early 20th century. And today we're going to begin discussing how the United States uses those actions and the ideas of imperialism to work their way into other parts of the globe. And then we're going to look at the United States involvement in World War I and how the United States is both transformed by the war and then also transforms the war. So the president who is the president of the United States in the years leading up to World War I and during World War I is Woodrow Wilson. Now, Woodrow Wilson was a political scientist himself, but he was also a governor of New Jersey, and he had a lot of skills in sort of thinking about politics. And when he becomes the president, his major focus is on what is called moral diplomacy. Sometimes we call this also liberal internationalism. This idea that unlike Theodore Roosevelt, who was his two-time successor, and William Howard Taft, who was his immediate successor, they involved themselves in other parts of the world. Roosevelt had the big stick theory, right? This idea that you have a big military that you can ultimately intervene in other places. Taft had dollar diplomacy and trying to involve itself through investment and bank involvement. For Wilson, it was much more about using the military to get involved in terms of using your military to support democracy, and this is going to become a big theme in the lead up to World War I. I'm sure many of you have seen this before, but there are 5 major causes of World War I. The alliance system, right? When you think about the Entente and the Allied powers, right? You have these 2 groups of people who, the Germans, the Austro-Hungarians, and the Ottoman Empire, as the Triple Alliance, ultimately the Allied powers, and then you have the Central Powers, and then you have the UK, France, and Russia, and Johnny come lately the United States, making this up, right? And that's what this map is going to show you here, right? Italy is at first part of this alliance of the central of the Triple Alliance, and then obviously they get removed, and then the Ottoman Empire joins. Now, there's a huge push of nationalism, particularly in the former Ottoman territories. You have Russia wanting to take over this territory. You have Austro-Hungary Empire wanting to take over these territories. And it's just creating a lot of issues between the different groups. And particularly for the people who live in that area, in the Balkans, there's a huge push towards a demand for nationalism and independence. And this is creating a lot of hostility and, a lot of tension between the empires, but also a lot of tension between the people below and the people, the Serbs, the Bulgarians, and all these folks, and the empires. There's also imperialism, right? We've talked about imperialism. I'm sure you've heard about imperialism. The push for European and American countries to establish their own footholds around the globe. And that is certainly true here in the early 20th century. But those tensions don't just stop in, Africa or Asia or Central America or South America. They come back home to Europe, to the Americas, and that creates tension between these countries. The other piece to this is militarism. We are well within the Industrial Revolution. We have the beginning of railroads, we have the beginning of submarines, we have the beginning of all these new technologies that are great for, killing people. And what happens as a result is you have a massive growth in technology, but also a huge buildup in military, where spending on military triples in some cases between the early 1900s and 1915. So you have huge growth in the military that's causing so many people sort of a desire to use these new toys. And then finally, the last piece is the assassination, right? Gavrilo Princip, a member of a group called the Black Hand, winds up shooting the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, killing him in Bosnia-Herzegovina in the city of Sarajevo. And this begins sort of the trickle effect to the war. Now, we're not going to get into the European side of this, but you'll look at the European side of this in another video. But ultimately what happens nearly immediately is that those new technologies get mobilized. So you have the machine gun, right? Now the machine gun had been used in other wars before, as early as the American Civil War. There are machine guns being used. However, not on this scale, right? We don't, now more people have access to these machine guns, and it really makes it a much more, a much more different type of fight. You can fire off, 120 rounds in a minute compared to, a single action gun now, right? We're no longer using muskets. That might be, 10 to 15 rounds in a minute. So again, we're changing the abilities here. There's also artillery, there's trench warfare, and we're going to look at a slide on trench warfare in just a minute. So there's other really more difficult and more dangerous types of weaponry that is available here, right? Aircraft. The airplane had only been invented about a decade before the beginning of the war. And now we have airplanes that can fly on reconnaissance missions, shoot down enemies, really do air-to-air combat. We have a far greater advantage here. Poisonous gas. These are, with the sort of trifecta here is chlorine, phosgene, and pepper spray, basically. And they attack your mouth, your face. They attack sort of all of the openings of your body. Machine guns, which I said. Mortars. Mortars are crazy because they extend the range that we could shoot at. These are small portable guns that can shoot quarter miles, half mile rounds, and they can do some very severe damage to somebody who is pretty far away. And then tanks, obviously, when we start talking about trench warfare and we start talking about the impact of that, right? When we start looking at how trenches are built, and we look at how, there's a stalemate because of it. People now with trenches and the space between, the no man's land between, where you put barbed wire and all these things, now you can sort of roll right over it. So if you look at this image here that I have on the right hand side, trench warfare was quite dangerous in and of itself, right? You had to sort of duck because you might get shot at. It was constantly muddy. Your feet would get really wet. This would cause something called trench foot, which was a really bad disease where basically your foot would begin to rot off your body. But the other piece to this is that there is a huge stalemate because of it, right? Because of the Schlieffen Plan, which is this German assault from Germany into Belgium and France. This basically, once you have these trenches, there's no way you can really get across, right? Trenches might be very close together. So if I just put this up here for a second. And let's say if I could draw here, right? If you have one trench, here, if you have one trench here and one trench here, right? And you have no man land in the middle, barbed wire across, right? Your best bet is if you could try and, get a person to go over the top. Let me try and change my color here. You could go over the top and maybe get over this, cut a hole, get through, right? Maybe you can take this, right? Maybe you can take this trench, but then it's only a matter of time before they come back and they try and do the same, right? So this is not a very easy process. This creates, as I've said, this creates a stalemate for the people within the war, and huge numbers of casualties will ultimately come from this as well. So the war begins really in earnest in August of 1914, and there's a sort of slow march towards the beginning of the war, but the fighting does ultimately break out in the fall of 1914. Now, the United States doesn't initially get involved, right? But the United States does, in fact, begin to trade with the Allied side, right? With the British, the French, and the Russians. Now, what they essentially do is they reduce their trade with the Germans to basically nil, and they shift their money towards the Allies, as I've said. Now, the amount that increases here is really quite substantial, and as I say on this slide, the increase goes from about $824,000 worth of goods in 1914 to 1960, where it's about $3.2 million, which is, for those of you who are paying attention, that's a 4 times increase, right? 400% increase. That is quite a substantial amount of money. Now, for the Germans, obviously their argument here is, well, if you are claiming neutrality, but your neutrality is very unneutral, right? If you are vastly contributing to other people, then you are not neutral. And instead, what you are doing is you are brokering in contraband. So they claim that their goods here are contraband, meaning goods that legally are part of war, and if they are part of war, can be taken as war bounty. So the United States claims neutrality. The Germans say they are being very neutral. And what you have happening as an effect of that is the Germans start targeting, and not necessarily as a result, right? In terms of naval warfare, as was on a slide earlier, right? The Germans and the British and the French and everybody are really starting to begin building up their navy here. And the Germans begin what is called unrestricted submarine warfare, basically targeting any ships that are on the open seas and can be targeted for goods. So they are targeting, they're shooting these goods, they're blowing up ships that are carrying goods, they're blowing up passenger ships, and it takes a while to negotiate the Germans out of this, because killing civilians is not necessarily a good thing for warfare. So the U.S. is still selling these goods, and slowly the United States is getting involved. So in April of 1915, a German ship blows up a British ship. The British ship is called the Lusitania, which was secretly carrying arms to the British from the United States. Now, this kills about 120 Americans. And what you have happening here is Americans really saying, well, if we're neutral, why are Americans dying? So this begins to push the sort of temptation to go to war. And then there are other events. In January of 1917, you have the Zimmerman telegraph, which is intercepted by the British. So it's a telegram that is sent from the German foreign officer Arthur Zimmerman to the president of Mexico. And the goal here is to basically say to Mexico, if you help us beat the Americans, we will give you back land that had been lost in the Mexican-American War in the 1840s, and you will be able to see benefits from us. This obviously enrages Americans, right? Hey, we're still neutral, but you're pledging that you're going to give land back to our neighbor to the south. Not cool. Then Russia leaves World War One. There's a Russian Revolution, and in March 1917, the Russians are forced out of the war because the Tsar is ultimately killed, and this sort of opens the way for America to say, we are here defending America. We are here defending liberty. That's where that idea of liberal internationalism, which was talked about a few moments ago, it comes up, right? This idea that America is defending liberty. America is defending people's rights, democracy, and it's a clear way to do an us versus them comparison. So Wilson, once America enters the war in April of 1917, the war comes to a pretty quick conclusion. So in January of 1918, America has been in the war now for about 8 months. The United States, President Woodrow Wilson offers what are called his 14 points. Now, the 14 points are really sort of a pipe dream in a lot of ways, but the goal here is to try and bring about what Wilson would call peace without victory, right? Bring about a settlement to the fight, a settlement to the hostilities, but not having a winner, and more importantly, not having a loser. So he sets up, as I've said, he sets up the 14 points, right? No secret treaties, freedom of the seas. There is more detail in these. But again, it's trying to settle a lot of the things that caused World War I. His final goal is the League of Nations. Now, the League of Nations is a deliberative body set up with a group of nations to try and preserve peace, right? It sort of would be the grandparent of the United Nations today. However, it was not very powerful at all. And sort of the big blow that came to it is that the United States never joins the treaty, never joins the League of Nations. So it's sort of an ineffective power all along. On November 11th, 1918, the war comes to an unofficial end. There is an armistice, basically a ceasing of hostilities. In December of 1918, the leaders of the countries, Woodrow Wilson from the United States, David Lloyd George from the United Kingdom, Georges Clemenceau from France, head to Versailles, to Paris, to negotiate a peace treaty. Now, the United States, Woodrow Wilson, wants there to be, again, peace without victory. So he is arguing for good treatment of Germany, or at least better treatment of Germany, right? Sort of give some land back to the people who had land taken, but really not to punish Germany. For the Germans and the French, there's really punishment that wants to be happened here, right? So, and ultimately the United States loses this, and there's a treaty signed in June of 1919 that really punishes Germany. The Treaty of Versailles is very, very harsh to the Germans. It makes them give up a lot of land. It creates countries that hadn't been created in a long time. Poland gets recreated. It breaks up the Ottoman Empire. It makes Turkey. It gives territory to the British in the Middle East. But the Germans are really badly punished. They are forced to pay huge economic reparations. They are forced to sign a war guilt clause. They are forced to demilitarize land that they had previously held. It's really, really a very, very harsh treaty. And what will happen here is these will be the things that will ultimately lead to the beginnings of World War II 20 years later. 20 years later. So take care and have a great day.